He kōna e purangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
Te he wa mauri ora ki te whai iau ki te maramaki iau we. Te he wa mauri ora ko Māpuna tēnei mihi atuana kia koutou katoa. Welcome back to Māpuna for this week's podcast episode. And this week we have two non-Māori guest speakers. They're both investigative journalists and both use archival data and AI to reconnect stories to whenua and indigenous communities, focused on land loss and also loss of economic opportunity for indigenous communities. But they are also looking to collaborate with journalists, Māori journalists here in Aotearoa, and in particular have an ask of some journalists on a project, but also the ability to continue to connect and network. They were here as part of a keynote, a presentation to Māori journalists at a conference hosted by Te Ao Māori News, the News and Current Affairs section of Whakaata Māori. They'll be talking about projects they've undertaken, as well as looking at the way in which you can protect indigenous data and kōrero for the use of reporting back to indigenous communities, as well as the accountability indigenous journalists have back to their own communities. That's Maria Parazo Rose and Tristan Ahtone on Māpuna this week for the podcast of Māpuna. No re te iwi, whakaronga mai, ki nei kōrero, ki nei kai kōrero, no tarawahi, e whakapua ki whakaaro ana mo te ao pāpāho, take. Whakaronga mai. Tristan, Maria, tēnā kōrero, kia ora. Welcome to Aotearoa.
Thank you.
Great to have you.
To be here.
Thank you both very much for making yourselves available. I know it's been a big 2 days. I think there are about 5 keynotes in the 2 days that you both had to make. We will get into that. But first of all, I just wanted to start with the personal stories. And I know grist is a big part of your work. But Tristan, how did you become an investigative reporter and why?
I never wanted to be a journalist when I was growing up.
I don't believe that.
No, it's true. I didn't want to be a journalist. As a matter of fact, I originally went to college for painting. So I went to university at the Institute of American Indian Arts. It's a tribal college in the United States. And I went there for painting. I had always wanted to be a painter my entire life. And while I was there, I needed to take my elective courses. One of them, I decided to take a journalism course. When I was growing up, there were always newspapers in the house. There were, weekly magazines like Newsweek, Time, stuff like that. So I was quite interested in journalism. I read it. I was regularly reading it. It was around all the time. Mm. So I was required to take this course, decided I would. First couple of stories were, your standard college journalism 101. There's an event or somebody's doing something interesting. But I think what changed it for me was that I was put onto a story I found a story because a lot of students were complaining about the university food, which is not unusual for college students to complain about university food. But there was something very specific in their complaints in that they were saying that the food tasted old. I thought this was a very, very specific complaint for students to have. So I decided I would take a look. So I walked down to the cafeteria. I knew one of the people who worked there, one of the chefs. Didn't require any sort of all the President's Men or Spotlight or anything. There was nothing hardcore about it. I just went down and asked. And this was 2003, so this was shortly after September 11th. And what I found out was that the Institute of American Indian Arts had a program where they were stockpiling food in case we needed to have a shelter-in-place situation and we needed to have up to 6 months of food to feed everybody on campus. And what they were doing was that when the food started to get close to expiration, they would feed it to the students so they could put new food on the shelf to store until it went bad too. Well, I thought that was pretty interesting, and I went to talk to the administration about it and wrote it up. And basically within days, they eliminated the entire program. They changed the program, said we're not going to do that anymore. We're really sorry about this. We're going to change up our policies here. For me, this was like a huge light bulb moment about what journalism could do. This coupled with the moments that I realized I was a terrible painter. So putting both of those two together, I figured out that the painting was not my pathway, but maybe the journalism was.
They do say all journalists are failed artists in some way, shape or form.
I mean, you don't have to rub it in.
No. Normally failed musicians, actually, is what I hear. But there's something quite intoxicating, isn't there, about doing something that has an immediate impact? That doesn't normally happen with most journalists' first stories, by the way.
No. I mean, it was incredibly lucky. And I think, to some degree, you're sort of chasing that high for the rest of your career in many ways. And knowing that there is power in accountability.
Yeah. Maria, tell us your story.
Well, I, unlike Tristan, wanted to be a journalist when I was very young. And I think it was just a matter of figuring out exactly what I wanted that to look like. And I think I had this idea of journalism as a potential career because my lolo, my grandfather, was a journalist himself. He was a journalist and then a lawyer and a judge. And one of the biggest stories he worked on, I'll just share it because I'm proud of him and I'm proud of the story. He reported on this group of students who were taking the bar exam to become lawyers, and they cheated on the bar exam. And in the Philippines, the Supreme Court is the entity that administers the bar exam. And so they were asking him to reveal his sources because it was indicating there was a leak. And he refused. And it turned into this whole situation where he was jailed for 2 months, and it was this whole Supreme Court case. And they ended up amending the law that says journalists don't have to reveal their sources, and amended it to basically enhance the protections that journalists have. And so that to me was just like seeing that the way someone could hold power to account, in the government, and seeing that within my own family, I think was something that inspired me. So I studied environmental science because I knew that that was the area that I wanted to report in. And after college, I worked in a nonprofit in Thailand for a few years. And another topic in the reporting that I do now that I think kind of originated there was that I saw there were I worked on child rights and migrant rights, and there were all of these migrants who were coming into Thailand who, for a variety of reasons, but climate change was one of them ultimately. And so I think it was this period in time where I was learning about climate migration before it became this big topic in the news, and I was learning about it from the people who were experiencing it.
When was this? Because it's a massive topic now.
It's a massive topic now. That was about 2015.
Wow.
And so, 10 years ago. And I think learning about the topic from the perspective of the people who are going through it just reinforced for me that that's what journalism can be and is. And so over the past few years, I've been taking on different projects. All of them, I think, have some element of data reporting or mapping in them. And in 2022, I went to MIT's graduate program in science writing, and that's where a lot of those skills were really honed, and that's where I met Tristan and started working on some of the projects that we're here to talk about today.
And I do want to talk about some of those projects, but the GRIST. What is the GRIST?
GRIST is a nonprofit newsroom in the United States. We focus on climate and the environment. That's our entire focus, is just reporting on climate, its impacts, how it manifests itself, the systems that are in place that make climate change more harmful, policy. It's our bread and butter.
Yeah. But the keynote that you both started with at this conference here at Hawaii Rangi and Whakaata Māori, with those Māori news and current affairs journalists, wasn't so much about the how of Indigenous storytelling, but the important was on the why. So the first question is, what is Indigenous storytelling, or what is Indigenous journalism, and why is the why more important, do you think, than the how?
Well, I think for me, it's really, the why is really what drives us, right? Like the how, what are the specific ethics? What are the specific tools? What are all the details of how you go about your job? I think that's kind of the how, and those are all very important. But for me, we really need to be thinking about why we do what we do. So when I think about Indigenous journalism, I'm thinking about a definition that is essentially a practice that works to support self-determination and sovereignty. I think it's different in Indigenous communities around the world on some varying degrees, but really I think when we have a particular reason, we have some sort of particular guidelines and protocols into why we do our work, these can be our guiding stars. And these are the things that can really inspire our work and push us to think differently about our industry, our craft, our colleagues' work, etc. So this is really why I am thinking about this, and I think why a lot of journalists in the U.S. or indigenous journalists in the U.S. and Canada are thinking about this, is that understanding and thinking about the methodologies that really guide us is vitally important to our craft.
Can I ask, what have you both learned so far about Māori journalism? As you say, there are varying things and differences in different indigenous communities, although what I've found actually is that there's a hell of a lot that connects and binds us. And also the way in which we tell our stories, particularly in terms of the communities that we work in and for, then separates us, which probably isn't anything that people haven't heard before. But what have you learned about our storytelling and Māori journalism, indigenous storytelling in Aotearoa, New Zealand?
I'll answer that question going a little bit back to the one you asked just before, which is more about Indigenous journalism. One of the things for me as a non-native reporter working in Indigenous affairs is that I've seen increasingly that for a lot of journalists in the West, the metric of what is right or wrong is often bound to law. Is something legal or is it not? And within Indigenous journalism, I'm often thinking about like, well, is that law something that should or should not be a law? Is that law right? Are the consequences of that law having an impact typically on Native people or Indigenous people around the world that should be questioned and held to account? And I think that's something that in the conversations we've had with the reporters here is a key framework, it seems, and at least where there are questions being asked or what topics are being picked at and pointed to.
What's most surprised you? There might not be any surprises. The reason I ask is because there are things that we have certainly learnt from you both, and I'll talk about those later on. But I'm interested to see if there was anything preconceived you thought existed with Māori storytelling, Māori narrative, Māori journalism that isn't there, or indeed something that just you didn't know about that is there.
I think for me, coming from the U.S. where I'm based right now, one thing that's been pleasantly surprising here is how much of a presence, honestly, Māori journalists have here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And that it seems like many of the non-Māori population here are at least aware of the topics, which isn't to say that they give it the full attention or respect it deserves, perhaps, but there is a lot more conversation happening. I think one of the challenges in the US is that there just isn't that amount of attention. And another thing that I really admire here is how much the language is a part of that whole process. So seeing that and seeing how dedicated these journalists, especially these young reporters, are to integrating that into their work has been something that I hope comes back to the US.
Yeah, Tristan?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the things that have really surprised or at least inspired me most has just been how unabashedly Maori everybody here is, and having that level of visibility too. I think it's really amazing to sort of see this, because I think in the U.S. we're generally an invisible population, in newsrooms doubly so. Even in newsrooms that have Indigenous affairs teams or desks, it's very easy to sideline our work or ignore our work or any of the things that we're sort of reporting on. So to see that y'all take up space and demand that space, I find incredibly inspiring to see.
I want to talk about land grab universities and that project, and your combined involvement in that project. What is land grab universities, and what motivated it?
Land Grab Universities is a project that began essentially in 2018, published in 2022 or 2020, that looked at how universities in the United States got their land. And spoiler alert, it was stolen from Indigenous peoples. We have this system in the United States called the Land Grant University System. And the system was essentially created in the 1860s. And it worked with the federal government essentially giving these newly formed universities large tracts of land so that they could sell to sort of turn into seed money for their endowments, right? So they needed money to get off the ground. The government gives them free lands to sell it, turn it into that cash, start their programs. Our investigative reporting was trying to figure out, obviously, where they got their land. And I think one of the crucial steps that these universities sort of forget is that they remember that they got the gift of free land from the federal government, but forget where the federal government got that land from first. So our task was essentially to find which tribal nations those particular lands were associated with, see what university that they went to, and to see how much profit those universities made off of it. In the end, what we were able to do was trace nearly 11 million acres of land taken from about 250 tribal nations, and then given to 52 universities, which netted about $500 million in profit when adjusted for inflation for those institutions to get off the ground. And it's this, it's acre by acre across nearly every state in the U.S. that we're having to track this land down because it's fragmented, it's kind of all over the place. And then, tracing where it's gone, basically. So it's joining these histories that are typically not joined. And I don't think for an audience that's told that, well, all the land was indigenous land before the United States was there, it's not a hard sort of theoretical jump to make or a historical jump to make. But it's very different when we can pinpoint with exact accuracy which parcels of land we're talking about, which tribe. We are able to show the receipts on this.
Yeah. How were you able to access all of that information to be able to then make the precise conclusions that you were able to make when you published?
Well, essentially, my team went to multiple different archives, and we're pulling land patents, we're pulling university reports, we're just pulling all of the information that would come with the sale and acquisition of land for every single sort of parcel that's out there. So it's essentially a deep dive into archives to sort of find this stuff. And the one thing that we know about colonists is that they absolutely love bureaucracy and paperwork. So to some degree, it makes it very easy to find this stuff. The thing is that it takes time. So that's essentially how we're doing this, is that we're looking at the paperwork that's generated around the sale of each one of these pieces of land and taking that data and putting it into sort of a system in which audiences are able to engage with it and understand essentially wealth transfer all the way down to a very specific acre, beneficiary, dollar amount, etc. So again, we wanted to produce a receipt on basically every one of these 11 million acres of land, and it is essentially what we did.
How was that report received? What was the response?
Well, slow at first. The story came out in March of 2020, and if listeners remember, this is essentially when COVID made landfall across the world. So states, at least in the U.S., are shutting down, cities are shutting down. Everywhere across the world, the pandemic is spreading very, very rapidly and frighteningly. Because High Country News, where this report was published as a magazine, we had been locked into a print schedule almost 6 months ahead of time. We couldn't move when the publication date was. So we were quite worried that because we were looking at our Twitter feeds and whatnot, saying that every story is COVID, 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 COVID. And then we have our story, Land Grant University history. It doesn't seem
historic information.
Would you like to hear about land grant universities? I know there's a pandemic and you're stuck in your house. So we were actually quite worried that nobody would ever actually read this thing because it's the worst time in history to put out a historical investigation.
Yes, COVID was second only to Last Dance with the Chicago Bulls and Michael Jordan.
I
think.
There you go. It's huge. So we were really freaked out about it a little bit. But it turns out a lot of people had time on their hands. And I think this is something that over the years has really picked up a lot of steam. We saw universities, land grant universities across the nation actually start to acknowledge the work. Changes in land acknowledgements. We saw free tuition programs for Native students start up. We saw a groundswell of truth and reconciliation reports that were coming out. We just saw this huge amount of movement from universities, and namely through students and instructors and staff that are pushing change up through the systems to administration. We've seen the citations on the story are always baffling and incredible to us, from everything from cancer research to medieval studies, reference the work that we were able to do on this. We're very lucky to really have played like a very large amount of sort of like systemic change in ties with these universities. Is it enough change? Definitely not. But to see that work has really driven an entire sort of movement and change in how people think about these institutions is incredibly gratifying to see that. And we don't know where the impact is going to land, but we know that since it's being seeded in so many different places, generations from now, I'm unclear what people will do with that information. But thinking ahead in the years, something was going to be coming out of this that I think feels like is very guaranteed, and what that'll be, I can only dream of.
Mari, I think one thing that the attendees really appreciated was, obviously the time that you have taken and the work that you have done, but also the processes you went through in terms of accumulation, and then how, in which ways can we present that information that is not only digestible, but also presents information for the benefit of communities. How do you do that well?
It takes time, that's for sure. The project that Tristan was speaking to, Land Grab Universities, was the one that preceded the investigation that I came in on. So that was Misplaced Trust. And so I'll just explain a bit about that project before getting into the data component. But Misplaced Trust built on the Land Grab Universities project by applying the same logic of looking at land laws and policy to a different set of legislation. And so whereas the first one was looking at land taken from indigenous nations and distributed explicitly to universities, we were now looking at lands called state trust lands that the federal government was taken when the U.S. was colonized in the western half, and giving that land to states as this grid of parcels that states could use to sell or lease, and then use the profits from that to fund everything from public schools to hospitals to prisons to all of these different infrastructure needs that were used to prop up the state. And so Misplaced Trust, there was a set of stories that came out of that data set that we created. And the first one did look at universities. And so we mapped for that project specifically around 8.4 million surface and subsurface acres taken from 123 tribes, and that generated all this profit from 2018 to 2022, specifically as an example, around $6.7 billion for 14 universities. So creating that data set was a huge undertaking. But I think one of the things that made it particularly powerful was that from the get-go, our goal was to make it publicly accessible and legible and usable. So that meant throughout the entire process, we were documenting this very detailed methodology on where we were pulling the information from, what decisions we were making in terms of how to process the data, the code base that we were structuring in terms of creating the pipeline that would ultimately process that data set of land, as well as all this land use activity and financial information, to ultimately create what we think serves as a tool for reporters and investigators, but also tribal communities. And we say that because the design of the data set, because we're working from this indigenous journalism perspective, really we strive to prioritize how it could be useful to these communities. And so that meant literally structuring the data set, the maps that we made, the interactive maps, to be able to be read by tribes, like based on their own communities, tribal nations, right? So as opposed to just saying this university benefited from this amount of land, we're also framing it as this tribe was forced to cede this amount of land. And that kind of comparison allows tribes to be able to access financial information in a way where it's like, well, this is the amount. And there's so much disparity, right, in terms of how much money universities are able to make versus how much money was paid or not paid to tribes. So that framing shaped the way the data was created ultimately. But in addition to that, we also really wanted to make sure that this very complex data set was something that people who weren't familiar with data necessarily could use and wasn't so intimidating. So we held a lot of different trainings on the data. We made the data set and the methodology and code base accessible to, all these different publications before we published, with the goal being, if impact is the goal, then we want as many people as possible to report on it.
Yeah.
So we were showing how to use the data. We were showing, working with people one-on-one to figure out how they could make it relevant to their own local communities.
Yeah, because there's a school of thought that says what you've done is actually the antithesis of media.
Oh, yeah?
Is that you are sharing the data and the insights before you actually publish. Right, it means you lose your exclusivity and all that kind of stuff. In some cases, people will say you buried the lead. You've answered the question, but again, I just want to reemphasize, why did you do that? Why was it so important that you had the community and engage with the community before you published?
Because, when we're practicing indigenous data sovereignty practices, we want to make sure that the information is given to the communities who it's about, right? Like, this is tribal information. And we felt that the tribal nations needed to be able to access it in a way that didn't feel secondary to it just being an investigation consumed by a primarily non-native audience. So we wanted to make sure that it felt like they were at the center of it.
See, Tristan, what you're doing there, what you are both doing, is making yourselves doubly accountable. There'll be many journalists listening, many people who have been engaging with media in New Zealand who will go, that's too hard. Why would you do that?
Yeah, but it's not hard. It's very, very easy to partner and work with other people. So as Maria is saying, not only are we sharing the data with tribes so they understand what we're seeing, what we're reporting, they know how they're included, but we're also working with other reporters so that we can have that spread. We want that to be the conversation that day for when a story comes out. We think this is vitally important for these institutions to understand the foundations of their success. And we can't do that by ourselves. Like, we cannot expect that everybody is going to stop what they're doing and read Grist to find out about state trust lands, right? But we can expect that, the Salt Lake Tribune and High Country News and all these other outlets that are publishing at the same time, we can expect that their readership are going to engage with the story as well too. So we're spreading that information. We're making sure that reporters have access to it. We're making sure that tribes have access to it. We want to make sure that the story is the most important thing.
Do you think that is one of the most crucial concepts of Indigenous journalism, is that direct accountability back to community?
Oh yes, 100%. I think as Indigenous journalists that we have a much higher level of accountability than our non-Indigenous comrades or colleagues. Comrades might be a bit of a stretch sometimes.
We're accountable to our sources.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of focus on journalists holding other people to account, but within this space, there's accountability that journalists hold also.
Journalists are pretty terrible about being held accountable for their work. I think there's a long history of journalists sort of shrugging and saying, well, this is our job. We're an important class of workers that do this very important thing, and that, sure, we might have come in and insulted an entire community. We might have broken every protocol that was there, but we needed to get the story, and therefore we do not need to be held accountable. And that's it's completely the antithesis of what Indigenous journalism is, or how we behave in our communities.
And that's certainly the experience of many Indigenous communities when it comes to the media. There is still a distrust of, if I could put it this way, mainstream media when they're dealing with Indigenous communities. So I take the point, I think you both.
They never have to come back.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly.
We do.
Yeah, exactly. You're listening to Māpuna on RNZ National. Our manuhiri, our kai kōrero, our guests on the show today, Tristan and Maria, Tristan Ahtone and Maria Rose, investigative journalists who were the keynote speakers here at a conference called Reimagine at Hawaikirangi Whakaata Māori, with Māori news and current affairs journalists. I think listening to you both throughout this conference, there's another thing that has happened which you may not have been aware of, although I think we mentioned it and a couple of people mentioned it. Time. And I think one of the responses from many of the participants here is the need to take time if we're telling these kinds of stories. How do you do that? Because in Aotearoa, many will say, and I think you may have heard it from some of the journalists, that we simply don't have the time because we're funded in a way that means we have to have daily output. How do you create that time that you talked about, Maria, and that I think you've alluded to, Tristan, to be able to tell these amazing stories that you're both talking about now?
I mean, I think it's the choice from the get-go. We're not held, it is a privilege to not have to be held to that timeline and that schedule of something daily. Because not only do these stories take time to produce, but you need the time conceptually to even understand, I think, what it is you're trying to do. Like all of these projects that we've talked about, when people ask us how long it takes, we're able to give a timeline of 2 years, 18 months, because you're theoretically starting from the point of when did we do the pre-reporting to when did we publish. But the idea for land grab universities that Tristan first worked on, that was information that a historian Bobby Lee had been working on for a while, and so these are things that people are noticing, starting to come together on. Like these are not just ideas that appear out of nowhere. And so to be able to produce something that reflects the story we're trying to tell takes time to do the work and necessitates time to even understand what it is we're trying to show.
I mean, and if I could, I suppose, speak from the point of view of management, because that's what I have been most of the time for the last few years. Maria's absolutely right. You need that time. But you also need a newsroom that is going to find ways to prioritize that. So the daily grind is something that we all have to do. How you go about doing that is I think the deeper question. Like, does it need to be as hard core as you're doing now, or does it mean that you have a particular team that's dedicated just to that while you have another team that's working on long form investigations? There's all these different ways that you can sort of slice and dice your newsroom to make sure that you're still meeting the needs of your audience and you're meeting the needs of your funders and all of the other factors that you have.
After the keynote yesterday, you both reached out, I think, with an opportunity but also an ask to try and collaborate with indigenous journalists here in Aotearoa, with Māori journalists here in Aotearoa. What was the ask? And how do you think Māori and other indigenous networks can collaborate? But what was your ask to Māori journalists here?
My particular ask, I suppose, to be very precise about what it was specifically, I'm working on a project about indigenous land return models around the world. And one of the reporting questions within that project is looking at Canada, Australia, and Aotearoa, New Zealand, as the 3 countries in addition to the US that voted against the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which is the standard, right, international standard for respecting Indigenous rights. And since then, in 2007, all 3 of those countries have acknowledged UNDRIP to different degrees. Canada has started to incorporate it into domestic policy. Australia's mostly ignored it, and recently Aotearoa's, the right-wing government here is turning away from it. And so my question is, how does the recognition of sovereignty or lack thereof shape Indigenous land return models? For example, in Australia, where there hasn't really been much recognition, a lot of the land return projects are buybacks, which is a financial transaction, and that is a way to theoretically return land, but it is not, in and of itself, recognizing sovereignty. So this invitation to the reporters in the newsroom here was, wanting to collaborate, especially because, no one knows this space better than Māori journalists and this topic and the treaty rights. And we feel that this project, especially if it's to be worldwide, needs to be very closely collaborated with Indigenous journalists in these places.
Yeah. There has been a long history of us talking, and I say us in terms of Māori journalists, but talking with our Indigenous brothers and sisters across the world. Collaboration is not a new word to us. We've been talking about this for a long time. Why hasn't it happened to the degree that it should have happened, do you think? And how do we change that, Tristan?
Well, I mean, I think some of the most basic barriers that we're talking about here, I mean, it's only been in the last decade or so that we even have the technology to be able to facilitate real-time collaborations. 10 years ago, we would be able to meet, we'd be able to talk about this, but then continuing a conversation, I mean, that's over email or something like that. Maybe a text message, right? Like, the systems weren't in place to be able to facilitate that. That's one thing. I think second is that while we're having these conversations quite a bit, I think that being able to meet each other establish relationships and be able to continue meeting is really a big thing for us. When in the United States, when we are meeting sometimes we don't trust other people until we can meet them face to face. We need to be able to build a relationship. I think it's the same here as well too, but the topic is still the same, right? Especially as we cover climate, the race for critical minerals is impacting everybody at this point. Almost every indigenous community on the planet is being impacted by this race for critical minerals. This is something that we are able to start talking to people about and saying, hey, what are you seeing? How can we work together on this? So I think as we're looking at sort of the futures that we want to see for our communities, for our peoples, it gives us an opportunity to start talking and saying, how can we put the story first?
Yeah.
How can we work together to make sure that this story is out? And how can we bring all of our resources together and make something that's really truly worthy of our audiences? That's something that informs them and something that educates and really raises the level of conversation.
Yeah, there's certainly been content sharing previously, but there hasn't necessarily been a collaborative approach to certain projects, the likes of which that you're talking about, which is really quite exciting. Do you think Aotearoa is ready to be a part of that?
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah. I mean, I think when you ask are they ready to be a part of it, I think the reporters here are more than capable of asking those questions, and are thinking clearly that, as we saw in the workshop over the past few days, that they're thinking about these questions and asking about it. I think the more important question maybe here is figuring out how to make what's going on in Aotearoa relevant and show exactly how relevant it is to all of these other countries. And I don't think that responsibility falls solely on any one particular set of journalists. I think it necessitates that conversation, and also figuring out how to just in general communicate the importance of treaty rights across all these different countries to non-native communities. And that's an exercise that I think falls on all of us.
There was a phrase that was mentioned in the conference which was, I found a little bit enlightening and also kind of interesting. The phrase was, are we activists or journalists? And we talked about bias and positionality. Is there something wrong, do you think, with being an activist and also being a journalist?
I mean, not necessarily. I think if you're sort of open and clear about it. But I think, again, this is sort of the reason why we need to start working toward definitions of what indigenous journalism is. If you're working in a system in which your work more or less shores up the importance or the legitimacy of colonial government, for instance, anything you do outside of that is going to be activism, right? In the U.S. context, journalists are often working for the good of America, right? There are so many different projects and stories that come out about, a better future for America or how we're saving America. I mean, journalists really love working for a better America. This is something that's really, really common in journalism spaces in the U.S. Of course, I'm going to look like an activist if I think it's wrong to, if I need to report and I think that it's wrong to destroy a sacred site that's important to my nation, right? If that's something that is important to me, and I am on the receiving end of that sort of democratic project there, of course I'm an activist. I mean, in the past I would have been a terrorist. So, if you are working in a space in which your work has to shore up ideas of nationhood or statehood, for colonial government, yeah, it's going to be a problem. But I think as an indigenous journalist, if I'm working toward, again, self-determination and sovereignty, it's not unusual to say that this is a sacred site, this is important to our community, and we need to report on what the impacts of this destruction will be for us, for our now, for our past, and for our future. This is a very different game that we're playing, and I think that's what makes it important.
Yeah, and so given the New Zealand experience, most media outlets are funded by the state, and there seems to be, I think for a lot of the journalists that you've listened to over the last few days, not an abdication of that responsibility, but a slow withdrawal. Retrenchment's probably the better word in terms of investment into broadcasting media, journalism, and in particular indigenous media. How, therefore, do you think can indigenous journalism, how can it be sustainable? How do we make it sustainable so that it can continue to exist? And is philanthropy the only way forward, do you think?
I'm sure Tristan can speak to the philanthropy side of things because he often is put into the position of having to think about that.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that can make it more sustainable is to teach it more broadly as an approach to journalism so that it becomes something that non-native journalists also practice. Like, I'm not native. I don't think you have to be indigenous to be able to think about journalism in this way. And I think to some extent the question of journalists being biased is kind of tired. It's a tired question. Obviously, journalists have bias. And when it comes to this idea of activism, being an activist or a journalist, I think within journalism we're always asking questions about power. And in this case, I think we're just asking questions about power that people aren't necessarily used to. And in the US, when we're talking about indigenous journalism, the way I explain it to some of my colleagues is that, or my friends, I'm not always explaining this to colleagues, but if you're a Western journalist and you're questioning, like I mentioned at the start, whether something is right or wrong, legal or not, the standard against which that is compared is the Constitution, something against the law of the Constitution. But the Constitution in the US rests on treaties with tribal nations, every single one of which has been broken. So to a tribal nation, why would the Constitution be the basis of law upon which everything is measured against? So I think being able to show how relevant that way of asking questions is to many people, not solely indigenous journalists, I think is a way to make that practice of indigenous journalism more sustainable. Do indigenous journalists need more funding? Definitely, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree, is that if this is something that is more normalized in terms of how we practice our craft, as Maria was saying, if journalism schools even had a singular class on this, we're already, it's like cigarettes. You want to get them while they're young, right? Like that's, you're bringing them in. Terrible.
Don't advocate for cigarettes on here.
But
I was going to say something, but I want you to carry on. You go, I think I know what you mean.
Get them while they're young.
Get them while they're young. That's right. I think Maria's 100% right. Is that we have to be teaching this. We have to make sure that everybody is exposed to these, this style of doing reporting, right? But again, beyond that, I think, maybe one big question is, what do we define as sustainable? Indigenous journalists, we've been doing this for centuries. Yeah. It's never going to go away, right? Yeah. This is not, if all of our news outlets shut down across the world, next week, we are still going to be trying to communicate news. We're still going to be trying to write stories and find stories that make sense of the world, that make sense of the realities that we live in. We're always going to do this because we've always done this. But on the financial side, one thing again is to be thinking about collaborations. When we're sharing resources, which is something I think we all do very, very well, because we come from communities that need to share our resources in order to survive and do good work. This is one way, I think, in which we can really stretch a dollar. And in which we can also get our stories out much more widely. Nonprofit space is unstable. The whims of a lot of these foundations can change from year to year. Nothing is stable, more or less, anymore. It's forcing everybody in the industry, indigenous or non-indigenous, to find new ways to survive. But I think one sure-found method here is that if we're sharing and we're talking to each other and we're not competing with each other, this is a huge step forward because we're all dealing with the same situations. There's no point in us competing anymore. As far as I'm concerned, if I'm in a room where I'm having to compete with somebody, I need to question, is that a good relationship? Yeah. And oftentimes I'll question whether or not the other person is actually involved in journalism.
Yeah. Tristan, Maria, tēnā korua.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
That was Tristan and Maria. They have been here in Aotearoa as a part of our conference hosted by Whakaata Māori Te Ao Māori News at its establishment. And that is Māpuna for this week. Thank you all for joining us in Aotearoa, New Zealand, no matter where you are across the country. Kia taunga manaakitanga ki runga kia koutou katoa, ki ana te kōrero. Ko te toka i Ākiha he toka whitianga rā, ko te toka i Māpuna, ko tāu e kite ai ko te ripukau. Te hewa mauri ora, kia tātou katoa.